regards to this book and how we make application. So remember, as we're going through this study and looking through the various books of the Old Testament, let us not lose sight of why it's there and why it's important, why it's valuable. I've heard of some before that will view the Old Testament in a way of kind of, it's confusing, it's bogged down, it's irrelevant to us today. And in respects to authority and direct application, we're going to be challenged a little bit. But let's be reminded and never forget what the value of the Old Testament is for us in our lives today. So let's go ahead and recall 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15 there. Paul's writing Timothy, says that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. And so as I examine the Old Testament, as I look at these books, as I look at God's plan unfolding throughout the years of history, I am growing in wisdom. I'm growing in fear of God. I'm growing in fear of His plan, of the deliverance of His promises. I'm encouraged and comforted knowing that all will be okay. Remember our application sermons in the afternoon. All will be okay. Part 1 was last week. All will be okay. Part 2, Lord willing, will be today. And this study, even Leviticus, even Exodus, and some of those chapters where you're really getting some minute detail, we grow in our fear for God. We grow in our understanding of His plan, and again, we can make application as it relates to the gospel for us today. Remember also what Paul told the Romans, Romans 15 and verse 4 there, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. God delivers on His plan. Doesn't matter how dark it looks, doesn't matter how difficult the trials are, doesn't matter how much time passes. God delivers, and I have comfort. I'm able to grow in patience. I'm able to understand what God is capable of. And you think about the Old Testament. Think about all the powers that be. Think about what we studied in regards to Egypt, in regards to Medo-Persia, in regards to Greek power, the Greek nation, Greece. You think about Rome and what they did. And you think about throughout it all, and throughout all the sin, by the way, of God's own people, He delivered. He delivered. So we're not just getting lost here in these books. I'm so grateful, by the way, for Steve and the pop quizzes that he's putting out there on band. That's very helpful because, hey, we're all in tune with this and should be throughout the week. And, we don't come here and just kind of go cross-eyed in terms of, look up there at that calendar and say, what are we looking at here? We can find application, and there's much to be made. Be reminded as well and reflect as well of Hebrews chapter 10, there in verse 1, for the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make those who approach perfect. And so remember how God did it. We got to see in terms of mankind the shadow first. So the Old Testament and what was taking place in the Old Testament, that's the shadow of the apple tree, if you will. But I'm interested in the apple off the apple tree. So when I go and I see the shadow, I'm able to get an idea of what the apple tree and the apple must look like, but I'm not interested in the shadow. The shadow points me ultimately to what it is that is creating that shadow. And so the gospel, we can find application. And we're going to do that this morning as well. Let's just kind of pick up a little bit where we left off last week in terms of this book in particular, the power of this book as it relates to who we are as God's priests. You think about Peter's epistles and what we looked at last week. I have been reflecting of some of the comments that you all made. Grateful for them. I know some said, hey, folks think it's strange that we spend so much time with the church. Folks think it's odd that we're constantly worshiping God, that we center our life around the work of the church, the worship and praise of God. Well, we're going to see as we look here in just a few minutes at the Levitical feasts. Folks, Look at the Old Testament. Uh, they had a completely different situation than what we have in terms of the continual work and practices that God had expected. Not to say we don't have work and a lot to do. We're under a better covenant. We do. But the feasts that we're about to look at, I mean, they were constantly coming together, constantly being reminded. It was continual. And we have folks today, especially in the denominational world, that will say, what about, for example, the Lord's Supper? Well, we don't need to take that every week. It loses its significance. Well, I don't know about you, but I'd like to see my wife every day, and seeing her every day doesn't lose its significance. Why? Because I love her. I don't know about you, but I like to see my kids every day, and seeing my kids every day doesn't lose its significance. Why? I love them. I don't know about you, but I like to eat every day. Why? Because I need it. It's nourishment. It doesn't lose its significance. I see the value in it. The problem is, the denominational world doesn't see the value in obeying God's command. And if you think about overdoing it, quote, as they would claim, when we look at these feasts under the Old Testament law, we're not overdoing it. And by the way, that's what God commands under the New Testament system by doing it once a week in terms of the Lord's Supper. As we're about to see what they were doing. But let's just kind of pick up where we finished things last week. Remember, we were primarily looking at the book of Leviticus in terms of holiness. Holiness. We find throughout the book the emphasis and expectation of God's people as it relates to being holy, being sanctified, being set apart, being pure. Something that this world is not interested in today. The clergy, a separate class of people, are not the ones that are supposed to be holy, and the rest of us just do whatever we want to do. We're all priests. And if you reflect and remember what we talked about regarding Peter's epistles as it relates to how God labels us there, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, you are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. Verse 9, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Is Peter writing unmarried folks who are clergy and separated and supposed to do things different than everyone else? No. Chapter 3 and verse 1, wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands. Sounds like those who are priests are married. Verse 7, husbands, likewise, dwell with them with understanding. Holiness is expected by God's people. You think about even there what Peter writes in chapter 1 of this same epistle in verse 16, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And then we started looking at chapter 4 in the same epistle. And notice there in verse 3, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. Chapter 5 of the same epistle, notice there in verse 8, be sober. What's the command? The command is to be sober, sobriety. At what point, according to the National Highway Institute, do I cross that path from no longer being sober? Well, one sip of alcohol, I'm now intoxicated. I've now left the status of being sober. I've left the status of being in a state of sobriety. And so the command by God is to be sober. The command by God is to be holy, be sanctified. Well, wait a second. Everyone's going to think I'm strange if that's the way I'm acting. Yes, God says that. Chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And to Sister Sharon's point last week, well, everyone thinks that my life is miserable because I don't do all these things everyone else does. Well, notice here again in chapter 3, in verse 10. He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Wait a second. So if I do what God commands, I can love life? Yes, that's how we can love life. There is no love of life in its purest sense outside of God's commands. we're not restrained. We're not limited. We're not walking around in straitjackets miserable. No. We are thriving in the commands of God. To be holy is to love life. But Satan is selling a bill of goods. He's selling a pack of lies, trying to convince everyone, well, no, you can't have any fun doing God's commands. You can't have any fun in holiness. You got to go do other stuff. You got to get your mind off your troubles. God says there, going back to chapter 5 in verse 7, right before, by the way, verse 8, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. So when I have troubles, how do I find relief from it? In holiness. Well, that takes work. Yes, it does. Hard work. But the rewards of it, consequences of it, true joy. And God's people under the Old Testament system, as we look here at the book of Leviticus, the instruction manual, as we covered last week, as it relates to the priests. Remember, the book of Leviticus, that title is off, really. It came from the Septuagint. The word Levites here is only found one time in the book. It's geared toward the priesthood. According to the pop quiz, by the way, that Steve put out, remember, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites priests. And so when I go here then to this book, what do I find as it relates to what God expected concerning these feasts? What are the significance? What is the significance of these feasts? And again, remember, a shadow of things to come. How do I make connection to these feasts as it relates to us today? And that's what we're going to look at here in just a moment. So let's start diving in here. And I'm going to have some read as it relates to where we find the establishment of the feast, and then we'll go through it. So let's start with the Passover. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 23. And if someone could read for me there verses 1 through 5 to start. Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus 23, verses 1 through 5. And by the way, as you start hearing months and days and etc., if you're interested and you're a tactical person who wants to know the nuts and bolts, here it is. And if that's an eye test for you, it's not meant to be. It's also sent on the Band app. You can look at it there. So Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. All right, thank you so much. Now let's go to Exodus 12, and this is going to be a popcorn situation, unless we have those like Tom or others who want to read 44 verses. But I think it's helpful for us. I think we need to really establish what we're looking at here. And again, it's helpful to just be reminded. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 44, and I can help as well. Let's read through this regarding the Passover. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 44.
And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months, shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for an house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of souls, every man according to his eating. Every man according to his eating shall make you count for the lamb. Make your company. Let me get that. According to the number of souls. Every man according to his shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, male for the first year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats, and ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood, strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doors of the houses, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus ye shall eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord.
Yeah, I will. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? That you shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. It came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel sojourned from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it." All right, so we have a lot here. A lot of details, a lot of specifics. God is very clear in terms of what he expects. The minutia that's laid out here for us. And yet, we would have some today that would shrug their shoulders and say, you know what, it's no big deal what we do. It doesn't matter whether or not we partake of the Lord's Supper, first day of the week. It doesn't matter how we partake of the Lord's Supper, first day of the week. Some, even in the denominational bodies, will actually insist upon alcohol being drank as a part of the Lord's Supper during what they call the Lord's Supper, which is interesting because what would have been required in order for that fruit of the vine that Jesus partook of when he instituted the Lord's Supper during this time, if it was alcoholic? Leaven, which they were not allowed to have. So it was not instituted as an alcoholic drink. And so it's interesting when you start looking at these details. Now, why was that so important? What did God say regarding the leaven? God made it very, very clear that leaven was not to be found, and if it was found, what was going to happen? Well, they were going to be cut off. For whoever eats leaven bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. No leaven was to be found in their house. Very specific regarding where the blood was to be spread. Exactly how the sacrifice was to be managed and dealt with. Let me ask you a question again. Does God care about the details? What was the purpose here of the Passover? First month, 14th day. And by the way, we got a little bit into the Feast of the Unleavened Bread there as well, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread is right after the Passover. It goes from the 15th day of the first month until the 21st day, as you heard there in the passage we read. And again, that's actually noted in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 5 and 6. If someone go ahead and read that for me. We'll just go ahead and hit both of these at the same time. They're so close together. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 5 through 6. All right, thank you so much. So you have the Passover, 14th day, first month. You have Feast of the Unleavened Bread, 15th day through the 21st day of the first month. And the connection here between the two, remember what took place regarding the Passover. God passed over his people, but what did he do to their enemy? Destroyed the firstborn. The remembrance there of the 10th plague. God is to be feared. When we approach God, we are approaching the Almighty. We are approaching the Creator and Sustainer. We are approaching the one who is the destroyer in terms of those who oppose him. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 12. If someone could read for me 28 through 29. Hebrews 12, 28 through 29. Yes.
Wherefore we receive, therefore we receiving a kingdom that cannot be moved, let us have grace, whereby we may serve God acceptably, reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire.
All right, so we are to serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. He is a consuming fire. Do we fear God?
We do, and then you have to look at fear. To me, it's a higher fear because we wouldn't know and understand.
Sure,
So I think fear of a loving fear that
sure, sure,
that fear that if we do the least thing wrong,
sure.
fear of hell. But he loves for Father has Son has Father sometime that Father has responsibility, human punishment.
Sure.
God do it.
Sure. Sure. And we see the consequences throughout the Old Testament. A lot of times people say, well, the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament. Actually, in that book we were just in, Hebrews 12, verse 29, our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews 13 and verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God means business. I can't be flippant about his expectations, about approaching him. He, in a swift moment, made it possible for an entire nation to escape Egypt. And the Passover was a remembrance of that. And you recall there in that context of Exodus 12, 1 through 44, God says, when your children ask you, what does all this mean? Why are you doing all this? You tell them what I did. You tell them of this account. Young people sitting sometimes in services, they don't understand what we're doing. Correct? They have questions. Why are you partaking of a little cup there? I want some juice, right? Some congregations will say, well, the children, they're a bother. They need to, leave. They need to get out of here. The children were present. Children were present. Matter of fact, even if you look at the New Testament, as Paul is instructing the congregations there in the first century, as he's also commanding in those instructions that the letters that he is writing are to be read to other congregations. Take, for example, what he writes in Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4 and in verse 16, now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. Well, who does he address here in this letter? Colossians 3 and verse 20, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. People say, well, I don't want my children to be present during worship. They're a bother. They're asking all these questions. They have all these things to say. Yes. Opportunity. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. By the way, listen to the preacher because he's telling you what God says, and God says you are supposed to obey me. I mean, at what point, folks, do we finally start training our children?
They can't learn if they're not there.
Right. Right. congregation sometimes, well, until the children are 5, just, you leave them out. Well, that's pretty late. God wants us to discuss, talk about, explain why we're doing what we're doing. Why are we partaking in this? Why are we engaging in this? What does this mean? What is the purpose of this? And I think sometimes what it boils down to is the adults just don't even understand or know, and the adults don't care. They're not really sure. This is what I'm supposed to do. Wait a second. Why? What are we doing here? For a child to ask that question, what a blessing. Let's understand why we're doing what we're doing. And by the way, this isn't the only place where God said this is going to happen. Deuteronomy chapter 6, same situation. God says, you have my word flowing abundantly throughout your households. And guess what? When your children start asking you questions, opportunity. Yeah. Which, as it relates to whether or not I'm going to do it, is a great thing. But as it relates to my understanding of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, it is a blessing for children to be curious and inquisitive and to understand the meaning behind it all. That's not something that should be shut down. That's actually an opportunity. Now, again, it takes a lot of work. But aren't we as adults capable of understanding and differentiating between being argumentative versus literally not knowing or understanding why? I mean, when a 6-year-old says, what is it that we're doing? Is that the time to say, hush, don't ask any questions. We're just supposed to do it. Now, when a 25-year-old says, why do we have to do this? Well, that's a different story after they've been doing it for 25 years. Yes, that's the time where it's saying, look, this is what God says to do. Now, we can further evaluate this again if you want to. We have to be able to make that distinction. All right, let's look at the first fruits here. Exodus chapter, well, let's start in Leviticus. Leviticus 23, 9 through 14. Leviticus 23, verses 9 through 14.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, bring the sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And ye shall offer that day when ye wave the sheep and he lamb without blemish of the first year of for a burnt offering unto the Lord. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2 tenths deals of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto the Lord for a sweet savor. And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine, 1/4 part of a hin. And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ear, until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings.
All right, thank you, brother, so much. Let's go to Exodus. If someone could read for me 23, 16 through 17. Exodus 23, 16 through 17. Feast of the first fruits and this offering happen periodically throughout the year. Exodus 23, 16 through 17.
You want to start before that? Mine's separated.
Yeah, you're welcome to if you'd like to, but it's talking about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread in 15, and then 16 and 17 is more of the first fruit.
I'll start up here in 15.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded thee, in the time appointed of the month of each. For in it thou camest out from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labors, which thou hast sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy labors out of the field. 3 times in the year all thy males shall appear before the Lord God.
All right, thank you, brother, so much. So the feast of the first fruits. How do we make application to this? And we understand, of course, let's go to 1 Corinthians 16. Someone could read 1 and 2 for me. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. All right, let's look at 2 Corinthians 9 and start here at verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you always, having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. Being liberal in our giving, being abundant in our giving. You see in the Old Testament, they had this periodical practice, a giving of the first fruits, feast of the first fruits, and we think about the way in which we prosper, whether it be just, hey, on a weekly basis, or whether it be bonuses, tax refunds, etc. What an opportunity for us to be able to then give of our means back to the Lord. We also have Feasts of Weeks, or Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sabbath Day. Several instances there of praise, again, of remembrance. Throughout the calendar year, God's people were in a continual practice of being reminded and coming together to reflect upon what he had done for them. What a blessing it is that we get to do the same. Thank you all very much.